Eli Klein, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's
It's a
we're
pleasure to be here.
delighted to have you. Tell me a little bit about your story. You're in the COVID news now. You're one of the heroes of the what we might call it the COVID contrarians resistance movement. But but it's an unlikely place to find one. You're a gallery. You're an art gallery owner.
Yeah, first, just to rewind for a second, I'm not so sure that contrarian is so applicable. Uh, I mean, are you still a contrarian if you haven't been wrong since 2020? I'm not so sure. I think that maybe the mainstream is more, at least, contrarian in that respect.
Right.
Um,
Yeah,
and
I mean you're not contrarian to common sense and good science.
right,
You're right.
right,
You're contrarian to the party line.
right.
But what? Just give us a little background about your situation and what you do and how you became sort of a prominent voice um, about the.
Well, I mean, I'm born and raised New Yorker. I was from Greenwich Village. I live in the West Village now in Manhattan. I own an art gallery here. I've had my gallery open to the public for over 14 years now. Um, my focus is Chinese contemporary art. So I represent living Chinese artists, and that's what I focused on for again over 14 years. And um, now I'm, kind of uh, happy to say we're really kind of the most active, longest lasting, most prominent, established gallery outside of China for Chinese contemporary art. So, that certainly is interesting given the nature of the relationship with China and how it's changed uh, since COVID largely. And, it's been an interesting uh, time for my business. But with respect to kind of activism in just speaking truth to power on Twitter, I think I was really uh, moved in that direction by Governor Cuomo. New York Governor Cuomo really uh, instigated my voice. And he was just so wrong on COVID early and often and obviously that it was just, it wasn't something I could stand by idly and not try to speak out against. Um, it was, I think awkward how much media praise he got.
So how did that how did you see that? Because obviously a lot of people didn't see it. I mean, the media didn't see it. But what was it about what was going on in New York that struck you as being wrong-headed from Cuomo and the public health establishment?
Well, one of the first things, not the first things, but one of the first things that struck me is how they decided, or Cuomo decided, that he's going to, for lack of a better word, fearmonger kids and schools. So just, as early as April, he was putting up slides during his press briefings about how dangerous COVID could be to kids, about how we thought kids were mostly spared, but they're not. Just scaring the heck out of parents to no end, and it would be a main focus of his for some kind of bizarre reason, whether that was uniting people, and he was using it as a way to play this kind of authority New York State father figure. I still don't know, but it was just I
But
knew the
right.
long-term damage that it would cause right away. As soon as he started it, I said, holy smokes, is this for real? Like, is he really going to, scare millions of parents? And these press briefings were watched beyond New York, but is he really going to focus on exaggerating the COVID risks to kids? And he did, and
But
that was just
right.
unacceptable.
No, that's remarkable that you had. But how did you get the insight that COVID was not is not bad for kids? I mean, did you just from reading? I mean, did you start to educate yourself about? Because I mean, if you're the average person, you tend to defer to the public health authorities, right? I mean, they know, they have the data, they have this. If they think it's a terrible risk, then we'd better obey and lock ourselves up.
Right. Well, I would say I never looked at Cuomo as a public health authority. I always, because he was obviously not, but I always looked at him as a politician. And I look at this as, partly was kind of a political decision that he was making. And we learned pretty early on the age ranges that COVID affects. And, we knew relatively quickly who is, primarily at risk and who isn't. This information was there. It wasn't me, putting together what other people didn't know. It was me reading, relevant studies or articles or whatnot, and knowing the data, and understanding that that Cuomo's kind of fear mongering was entirely disproportionate to reality,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
understanding what kind of drawbacks there would be for the long term. And we're still burnt by Cuomo's lies about kids in schools. He lied about schools being dangerous until basically November 2020, way past worldwide data being in that it wasn't true, for political or other reasons. But New York still has and thousands and thousands and thousands of students, public school students, that are simply missing from school, and whether that's the result of irrationally afraid parents or otherwise. Certainly, a lot of it is falls back to Cuomo.
Right. You mentioned your just it's kind of an interesting angle. Did you have any inside information from business partners or artists in China? Do you deal with artists living in China, contemporary artists living in China? Did you have any kind of inside track information about the situation there?
Look, I do substantially. I mean, I speak to people and an assistant in China every day, and a lot of people. And I, whether that's by WeChat or phone calls
Mm-hmm.
or video conferences, I certainly do have kind of an inside track, and that's given me actually a very different view on China's COVID situation than other contrarians may have. And I'd say when I have spoken out about what I really think is going on in China, that's based on on my knowledge from speaking to people that live there. It
Yeah.
does get a lot of my peers very upset.
Well, that's great. Can you share? Because I think a lot of people don't know, and including myself. I mean, I don't have a good sense of what's going on in China.
Sure, and this isn't going to be popular along with anybody necessarily, but I'll share the way I feel, and what I've learned from information that's been provided to me. I think that there's this whole kind of more than a theory, but there's a whole line of thought that there's tens and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of COVID deaths in China that are being covered up or underreported or unreported. That China just let it rip and faked lockdowns so that the rest of the world could destroy themselves with these lockdowns that largely haven't worked. There's all these kinds of things that people say is going on in China, and when push comes to shove, you know, uh, frankly, look, it's just not true. I mean, China is able to do things that the United States or Europe or democracies simply aren't able to do. I mean, we're not able to weld people into their homes and completely have what I would call true lockdowns. We have these leaky lockdowns
Hmm.
that aren't sufficient in stopping a highly transmissible airborne respiratory virus. But certainly what China did in Wuhan, for example, and when they locked down the entire country, for China, that worked. As much as people want to deny it didn't work, but what they have done is I had someone come to my gallery today, really, a a curator at a museum in Beijing, and he was telling me about his quarantine when he goes back to China, and it's going to be at least 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, and he was completely resolved to the fact that it's going to happen. But in China, the quarantine isn't these kind of BS quarantines that we have here. It's you are locked in a hotel that you cannot choose. You are delivered food at your door that, of course, you cannot choose. You're not allowed to leave your room for now. I think it's up to 3 weeks now. You're tested multiple times a day. All these
Right,
different things.
right.
There's a whole system of things that they do in China, which would never ever work here and wouldn't work in most of the world. But it has contained, up until now, COVID much better than, of course, the United States has contained it. And as much as people want to deny that, I don't think it's very helpful for credibility to deny what has happened. Now, China has an unbelievable problem facing them in that either they have to do this forever and not have any tourism for the most part, and really have these kinds of what would be viewed as crazy restrictions anywhere else, or they can finally open up to the world and let it rip,
Hmm.
and let COVID do its thing. I mean, it's at some point going to be one or the other. And China has almost vaccinated everybody. That's going to save a lot of lives, but certainly not every life. Um, and when push comes to shove, China has a massive decision to make, and that's whether to participate in the global economy and accept tourism and travel for the foreseeable future, or keep this kind of lockdown mode forever, which would
Right.
seem crazy, just because of one virus that an entire country is vaccinated against.
Okay, great. But it's interesting that at least your knowledge of that the Chinese lockdowns were indeed very serious and very real um, didn't color your thinking into being worried and say we need to do the same here, and unless we lock down the way the Chinese did, we're gonna have, and I'm talking about the in the early stages of the pandemic in April May 2020.
Well, it did. In March, it did. In March, I certainly thought that this potentially that New York. I knew New York, that this was spreading in New York well before we had any restrictions at all, and
Mm.
I took measures to make sure my father was protected. But I think it's rational and reasonable to look at in early March, to look at Wuhan, for example, and think, wow, they really did. This did work,
Mm.
right? But we learned, very quickly that that we can't do what they did, and it's just because we were a free country. and operate in a, in a way where there are what essential workers and other things. It's a completely different world, China, and it was obvious that we couldn't emulate it. And once it became obvious that leaky lockdowns don't work, and that's a phrase I used a lot in April of 2020, and people really didn't understand it, but leaky lockdowns don't work. A complete military style lockdown does work, but it just works to delay the inevitable, unless China chooses to have rolling lockdowns and stay closed to most of the world forever.
Right. And how was your business affected in the early stages? I mean, I imagine, like many businesses, you were shut down.
Yeah, I was shut down, absolutely. And of course, your business is shut down, you're affected. That said, it's not as though hundreds of people were going to come to art galleries in New York in April and May, when we had almost 1,000 people dying a day. So it's not. I thought that my business was inappropriately closed for longer than it needed to be. Once we saw the epidemic curve falling, it should have been obvious to Cuomo, that it's time to open everything up. But he ended up keeping restaurants closed throughout the summer of 2020, even when there was almost no COVID here, and only to open them in around the fall, when we're heading into respiratory virus season. And and that's just emblematic of how ridiculous his decision making was, and how easy it is to criticize, and frankly, how so much of the press just lost credibility by not understanding the basic problems with Cuomo's management of COVID and questioning it. Right. They just accepted that this is the way, and it turns out it wasn't the way.
And apart from the press, I mean, since New York was hit so hard, I mean, really, I mean, everybody was, worried about New York. I mean, it was on the brink in March. What about your, colleagues, business partners, other friends? Did they? I mean, were you sort of an outlier in your circle?
An outlier in what respect?
In terms of how you reacted to what Cuomo was doing.
Yes, I mean, I certainly was an outlier in New York. The vast majority of New York City. Now, I'm not talking about Buffalo or other places, but the vast majority of New York City, bought into everything Cuomo did, and would hang on his last words. So I absolutely was an outlier, but I spoke out against him early and often, starting in the very publicly on Twitter in the very beginning of April, and otherwise, in mid and late March. I mean, I thought he botched this thing in magnificent ways, and it was just amazing that somehow he was being praised for his composure, and being able to perform in front of microphones is much different than actually managing a pandemic properly, which he certainly failed to do, while getting credit for doing it.
But what? First of all, you are just to put it in a context. You are somebody that's been a supporter of. Were you? Did you? I should ask. Did you support Cuomo in the past, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I voted for Cuomo.
Yeah.
I'm a lifelong
so
Democrat.
you're not right. You're not like ideologically like opposed to. There's these folks that doesn't matter. I mean, Cuomo could, invent some new vaccine that is the COVID stopper, and some people in the country, half the people in the country may oppose it.
Right.
But that's not you. You are like a lifelong Democrat. You voted for Cuomo, and here, do you remember what I know you touched on this, but was there a single moment where you remember being like, this is completely ridiculous? Like, I mean, this man I cannot stand for. Like, what was by the way, I remember you were very active on Twitter in late March, early April, right? And I remember being like, who is this guy with these very strong opinions on Twitter? At the time, you had like 600, 700 followers, and I remember you replying to a bunch of things I said, um, and uh, and you were all over the place there. But was there one specific thing that Cuomo or public health officials said or did that was like, this is a lie, this is not true?
I'm going to circle back to what we talked about in the very beginning. I think it was exaggerating the risk to children. I mean, it was astonishing how bizarre it was, and how everyone didn't know it was a lie. But he was kind of clueless from the beginning. Once he put up a slide in April, he put up a slide telling people that already had COVID, that they have to worry about being reinfected in April 2020. I mean, which is insane, right? And there was no evidence of that. I don't know what expert told him that, but I think it's probably some of the crappy experts he relied on. But this was a main point that he made during one of his press briefings about reinfections, when before there was even one confirmed reinfection globally. And of course, people that had COVID, had immunity. So, all kinds of things like that. I mean, I could go back to my Twitter feed and search Cuomo, and I probably have, over 100 tweets, just, calling out specific things that he literally got wrong, right? So it's not, questionable, or that he was objectively incorrect about. And, most of the media couldn't be bothered to fact check.
Right. So again, how is it? Why do you think it is that you were able to kind of see some of this stuff, like the kids thing, like the low risk kids thing? I mean, that was clearly out there, correct? I mean, John Ioannidis, in mid-March 2020, like put out there that, hey, there was this significant gradient of risk. He was, of course, immediately lambasted, and he was, I mean, basically they attempted to run him out of town, right? And you don't hear much about him anymore, I think, in partly because of that. So it's really sad what's happened in the medical field. John Ioannidis is a physician who, prior to this, was a big-time researcher. I mean, he still is a big-time researcher, very well cited, wrote a lot, but he disagreed. He disagreed with lockdowns, and one of the reasons he disagreed with lockdowns and the way they were implemented was that this is a one-size-fits-all thing, and we weren't leaning into some of the advantages that that we should have leaned into, given that COVID seemed to be much more benign, or not seem to be, is much more benign as you get younger and as you have fewer and fewer comorbidities. So that was out there, correct?
Absolutely.
You, of course, again, as an art dealer, did latch onto that, looked at that primary data and said, that seems to make sense. So therefore, whatever slide Cuomo is putting up is complete garbage. And what the heck, why are we doing this? Why do you think that is? Is it because you're a business owner? Is this because you're just smarter than everyone else? Like, why is it that you have this, you're able to figure out based on, like, he's one expert saying something. There's a bunch of experts that Cuomo is listening to. So, number one, why is Cuomo not able to see what you're able to see? And then there's, of course, a lot of New Yorkers that disagree with you, right, Eli? Why are they not seeing what you're seeing?
I mean, look, those are great questions, and I think there's many different answers to them. I would say that the primary points probably that I tried to really look at this all apolitically, and just put politics behind me, and look at it independent of everything else. I think that Trump was so polarizing that if someone like Cuomo was seen as the anti-Trump, then Cuomo's words, everything he says has to be correct, right? And that was a huge mistake that other Democrats made. They didn't look at what Cuomo was saying with the appropriate skepticism and just uh, just understanding of the incorrectness. They just took it as perfect because he was being kind of touted as the voice of reason and control, when Trump was being touted as the person who botched America's COVID response. So I think, unfortunately, a lot of the inability to correct Cuomo and to fact check him and to understand that what he was saying was simply way out there and untrue, it was a result of a very politically charged um, position that
Right.
the country was in at that time. And most people in New York City weren't able, and a lot of them didn't follow the stuff themselves. And just, before we thought maybe if we hear, these kinds of things, they should definitely be true. It's not as though the New York governor is going to go, lying about disease risks to the
Although,
press, right?
Eli, I mean, I used to think that very strongly. I thought, the crazy response was a large part of, an anti-Trump reaction, but now Trump is, gone, and you have things even outside of the U.S., right? I mean, you have Australia. So this overreaction to the pandemic. I think at the end of the day is probably, I mean, the Trump factor was probably minor in this. There's something ingrained in the way some people usually of a certain political worldview tend to just act in a certain way. So
Right. I mean, I think that I'm perhaps, exaggerating Trump's influence on that. I think it was going to be politicized regardless, and Trump added to the politicization of it. Certainly the far left in America has, for whatever reason, been, for a large part, completely unable to grasp the actual risk that COVID presents. And such a large segment of them have been unable to manage their own risk in a reasonable and proportional way, that we assume they used to manage their risk before. I mean, people with healthy children, for example, that have, a flu level risk with COVID, treat it as though, it's, an order of magnitude higher than that, where frankly, these kids have been alive forever, normally accepting these other risks that are equal to or greater than COVID. It just simply doesn't make any sense to vastly edit the lives of children to avoid a disease that is just a small, minuscule, extra risk in daily life, for, as compared to everything they've faced for their entire lives. And, that kind of loss of perspective I agree with you, has just been astonishing. And it's hard to pinpoint exactly what it is. And I certainly don't put that whole thing on Trump by any means. But it happened. And I think that there's a degree of brainwashing that's going to be difficult to cleanse.
Yeah.
Anish, I think you're
as somebody who's kind of can you hear me?
Yeah.
As somebody very well outside the medical community, but still very plugged in, and you've watched the whole debate kind of roll out. How has your perspective on public health experts changed over the course of, like say 2019 to now? What are your thoughts on how the public health community is done?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of what I've, focused on since the first half of 2020 was really, um, and you know this, of course, but kind of calling out experts for lying. And prior to COVID, I never would have imagined that public health experts would simply uh, give false, intentionally misleading messages about public health um, on a consistent basis. And it's, I think I'll always be shocked by it, and I think we'll feel the repercussions of this kind of diminished reputation that public health now has. I mean, I remember my first kind of exposure to these kind of politicized infectious disease professionals were, I won't name names here, but it was almost uh, what I'll analogize as kind of the squad of epidemiologists on Twitter, that maybe in late April or something, I could tell, just as this as a focused, kind of art dealer that detects frauds and is able to look at the data. I could tell we're just simply lying for political purposes about something as big of a problem and big of a deal as COVID. And it was, I think, one of the most appalling things to me in my life is the corrupt and politicization of COVID by not only our country's infectious disease professionals, but other experts through and through. I mean, you have, and again, I won't name names, but really prominent people that invent, and you guys know this as in your field, invent athlete heart explosions and all this kinds of nutty things that people that you would think smart Americans know better than to believe, but they just swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. And what happened was kind of this concept of the more panic, the more safety, the healthier we'll be, took over. And it turned out it couldn't be further from the truth. None of that stuff helped. It only hurt. And I remember, them trying to cancel every sport and, every outdoor activity, and, closing beaches and playgrounds longer than they should have been. But just these wildly disruptive, asinine public health decisions that clearly, when you have a respiratory virus that spreads much more easily indoor, you don't close things outdoor, right? I mean, that's just just would seem to be common sense. And there was such a push to limit outdoor recreational activities, which of course ended up driving the disease spread even more. And just decision after decision after decision was not just guided by corruption or politicized or groupthink, but really guided by experts that aren't experts, that shouldn't be relied on, and that made monstrous mistakes that should have disqualified them as experts that we're still listening to. I'm certainly not listening to people that made these monumental mistakes that led to all kinds of extra problems in 2020. Why listen to them in 2021? There's people with better track records that I'll prefer to follow.
So now we've when the vaccines rolled out, of course, in late fall, a week or so after the elections took place. And you're a big vaccine proponent, right? I must say, you believe in vaccines. What have you thought about how New York especially has managed the vaccine rollout, specifically with regard to the nudge towards getting more vaccines, and that being, public health has basically decided that mandates are the way to get to where we need to go?
Right. Well, I followed the rollout very closely in December, January, February. Kind of a misallocation of the vaccines, which we didn't have much of. The failure to properly prioritize those most at risk. I think we could have done it quicker, and Cuomo didn't open it up to 75-year-olds soon enough. I pushed hard to get the right people, vaccinated here, and to keep politics out of the vaccination process from the beginning. But and you're right. I mean, I'm a big proponent of vaccines and of COVID vaccines, and I personally helped many people, book appointments. Eligible people book appointments during the priority period, where these people that weren't necessarily tech savvy or resourceful had to fight against um, you know uh, a stay at home kind of computer geek that had COVID already, that is somehow eligible and 20 years old, that can get an appointment right away. So it was a pleasure helping these. I only helped non-immune people that didn't have COVID already. Actually, that was my one criteria, that they were eligible and that they didn't have COVID already. So it was a pleasure helping them. But um, I've seen, unfortunately, New York lean into what I call vaccine extremism. And I think vaccine extremism, COVID vaccine extremism, is a de facto anti-vax position. I think that it has fueled vaccine skepticism in many ways, and has diminished the credibility of these terrific COVID vaccines. So, New York, for example, with its vaccine verification mandate, to to force people who had COVID already and have antibodies to get vaccinated in order to go to a museum, or a gym or a restaurant, or countless other activities. I think it's a huge mistake, and it people question the motivation of the vaccinators, and why do they want people that are already immune to vaccinate in order to do things, normal things, which they should be able to do. And all kinds of other things like that have really created skepticism around the vaccines. And I've avoided that even in September, October 2020, when the far left was again, I mean, I don't know what else to call it, but they were kind of anti-vaxxing, right? They were COVID anti-vaxxing, because they wanted to make sure that the the information on the Pfizer or Moderna trials, how successful they were, wasn't released until the election, because they thought it would help Trump and push and help him win the election. So it somehow became tolerable and mainstream for people like Cuomo to completely fill everywhere with skepticism about these COVID vaccines, just for pure political purposes. And I remember calling out renowned epidemiologists and other infectious disease professionals, and saying on Twitter, you don't really believe that the FDA is going to EUA a COVID vaccine without reliable efficacy data from phase 3 trials, do you? And that was a question they were kind of unable to answer, because the way that they were questioning these COVID vaccines, you'd have to be saying that in order to properly question them, but they didn't really believe it would happen. So it's shocking that I've kind of stood against this, what I'm going to call left-wing anti-vaxxing, where really not many people have. And of course, there's a real another a different kind of anti-vax movement that there's many other people to fight. And I'm obviously a big proponent of these vaccines, and don't don't take. I'm not diminishing how negative that component has been, but it's been something that has been really surprising, and I think forever I'll be impacted by just the damage that the politicization of public health can do, and I think we all will.
What do you think specifically about the mandates? I know you've spoken a lot, and I think you even were on CNN talking about the vaccine mandates. And do you think they're a good thing? Do you think?
I mean, I think it's really complicated, right? And I think that first, all COVID vaccine mandates that also apply to people with confirmed prior infections are just disqualified as unscientific. I mean, we have that data. It's very clear that these people are effectively vaccinated already, and we've never forced people to be vaccinated for a disease they're already immune to, right? So I think that's one of the huge problems that public health. It's just it's a mistake that is almost I'd say unforgivable, and it dates back to this kind of immunity denying bizarreness that from 2020. A lot of people made a mistake by including those with prior infections in vaccine priority groups when vaccines were few and far between in early 2021, and people that were clearly had immunity already were being prioritized ahead of people in nursing homes. And my father, and I think what happened is we vaccinated millions of people with confirmed prior infections before millions at high risk. And the people responsible for that tragic mistake, which probably led to the deaths of thousands, if not tens of thousands of people, are somehow the same people that are able to discuss and make rules that are applicable to these mandates, where they should really be the subject of a special prosecutor, in my opinion, for making such an obvious and big mistake. But number one, so they don't want to admit that that we should acknowledge what we'll call natural immunity, partially because they will also have to admit the catastrophic mistakes that they made in the past by not doing it all along. But vaccine mandates that ignore natural immunity are disqualified, all of them. After that, in certain settings, I would be able to entertain it, but perhaps maybe a hospital or a nursing home. But I'm not saying I support it or I don't support it. I haven't even been able to really think about it enough, because none of the vaccine mandates have actually been science-based in acknowledging that people who had COVID already shouldn't be subject to them. So there's that.
What about the businesses that there's many places now that as businesses they're saying that, look, you can't enter unless you have unless you're vaccinated. Right. Is that something that what are your thoughts on that?
I call that a vaccine verification mandate as opposed to a vaccine mandate where you're forcing people. I think they're two separate things. Yeah. I think that it's ridiculous. It's and I'm not going to mince words here. It's racist. It's anti-Semitic. It's discriminatory. It discriminates against children. It's wrong. And it's something that history won't look kind on. I think it's a catastrophic error by these big blue cities to
You don't think as a small business owner in New York City, and I imagine your art gallery is in a relatively nicer. I don't know honestly, but it's in a relatively nice part of town. Do you think like a lot of your customers, a lot of the folks that want to come in, want type of scene verification process before you allow people in? Like, do they feel safer, especially now that you can get breakthroughs? Obviously that the last 3-4 months, this idea that that 100% protective, you can get breakthroughs, and some people who are vaccinated can do badly. So there's protect yourself from the dirty unvaccinated. This again, that's in quotes. That's not what I'm saying. Is that something that you think is reasonable if your community demands it?
I mean, I think that's a complicated question. I do think a lot of New Yorkers only feel safe being in fully vaccinated venues. There's
How
a
did that
lot.
happen? How did that happen? How did that happen? Because I mean, I'm painting it. It was a kind of a leading question, because this idea that oh, they're lepers, they're sick, there's like, you got to keep them away, right? I mean, you have New York, which is a very progressive, liberal town. You would think that that's the opposite. Like, that wouldn't happen to most New Yorkers. Yet you have most New Yorkers, or many New Yorkers, I should say, who actually want this. Correct?
Right.
I mean, what do you think about that? Because this isn't from this isn't coming from Cuomo necessarily, or the governor.
Right.
This is coming from people.
It's demonstrative of a kind of theme that is applicable throughout COVID, where again, I hate to keep pointing to the left, but the left has kind of abandoned their core fundamental values in the name of COVID safety. And COVID monomania rules now, and whether policies are racist doesn't matter. Nothing matters but COVID all of a sudden. And to me, as I said, I like to think that I've kept my core values, that I look at this all apolitically, that I understand that if a policy was racist in 2019, it's racist in 2021, that that a vaccine verification mandate clearly has a disparate impact on Black New Yorkers who are disproportionately unvaccinated. It has a disparate impact on the Orthodox Jewish community who developed COVID at a higher rate than other New Yorkers and have disproportionate high levels of natural immunity and are disproportionately unvaccinated. It has a disparate impact against them. Children who might be naturally immune. You might have a naturally immune 12-year-old son who had COVID already, and you don't want to vaccinate him just yet in order for him to go into the go play or go swimming or eat with you in a restaurant. That shouldn't be the government's heavy hand to decide. That should be a parent's decision. And somehow Bill de Blasio has decided what the best and necessary it is for other people's children to participate in mundane activities of daily life is just an incredibly bizarre situation. I mean, the fact that a vaccine verification mandate would apply to any non-adult, anybody under 18, is something that I don't think I've harped on, enough. But it, in and of itself, I think, is disqualifying. That really is between the parent, the parents, the child's doctor, if the parent consults one, and the kid, when we're talking about COVID. So I think that that's a huge government overstep and just a big mistake. It's going to end in a loss of trust in government and in public health that will have unfathomable consequences down the road. And we don't know how many decades it will take to even possibly get this trust back, if ever. What ramifications it will have on other vaccines. on trust that was just normal for other vaccines, whether that trust will erode. It's really an experiment, and it's an unnecessary experiment. It's one that that isn't necessarily going to make other people safer.
Do you think, though, that the politicians are simply channeling what most New Yorkers want? Do you think the reason Cuomo is saying, or did say, these inexplicable things that the current governor, I forget her name, is saying the things she's saying? Do you think she's just reflecting what most New Yorkers want, what 51% or 52% of New Yorkers want, right? And if that's the case, does that make you very, very concerned for the state of democracy, as it is? I mean, because it may very well be, right, that the politicians are in some senses prisoners to, they want to get elected again, right? And are they going to go against what most New Yorkers want? So is the problem really, Eli, politicians, even the public health experts, or is the problem New Yorkers?
Well, a lot of it is the media and the experts, right? A lot of it are the media and the experts, really, because they have combined to shape the views of many New Yorkers, to largely shape it. So you're right. I mean, the problem is the problem. Look, the problem that over 50% of New Yorkers think 2-year-olds should be masked indoors indefinitely. That's a problem with New Yorkers. But that kind of level of insanity and pseudoscience was shaped somewhere, and it was shaped through this kind of brutal, repetitive cycle of experts plus media plus politicians, and you get this kind of groupthink that that regardless of how ridiculous it is in in a rational, sane world, somehow they think that it's right.
Eli, I think I mean, I agree with you, and I think it's because public health is actually an invention of the left. Public health is not non-political. Public health is actually an invention of the left. It emerges after the French Revolution. So imagine, I mean, if you want to make a big contrast, the right, the old monarchies and whatnot, it was like Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake, right? So there was no concern about public health, if you will, if you want to make a caricature out of it. Whereas after the French Revolution, right, so the left, public health is actually its core value, because it's not so much that they're concerned. I mean, of course, I mean, it claims to be concerned, and maybe for many of them there is a concern about the well-being of everybody, but it's primarily the method, meaning you're going to have experts, rational technocrats who are going to make the population healthy and the public safe and whatnot. I mean, that's the program of the left in many, so whether you talk about the big programs, social security, government, Medicare for all, whatnot, I mean, that's really the core value of the left. And to the extent that they, they're prominent in the media and whatnot, I mean, that's what they're going to impose. So I don't know that there's actually a public health that is apolitical. I think all these guys are on the left, and they're together, and I think so. I welcome a discrediting public health, because I think it needs to be taken down a notch, because we shouldn't be relying on the government to. I mean, all of a sudden we all accept that the government should be doing all these things, right? And that's wrong. They shouldn't be. They shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, Michelle is so correct, because it really, I think what Eli, what you're seeing is not necessarily, or that a lot of folks that profess to being for the common person, profess for these progressive values, it was all a ruse. It was all, and it's always been a ruse. And what they want, and what they're what they've always wanted is power, I think. And for many on the left, not everyone on the left, and I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing kind of this naked authoritarian.
Yeah, but it's power in a certain right. It's
but
power
if
in a
you
certain
give them
way.
that ability, yeah,
It's power in
yeah,
a certain way. It's power in this sort of scientific, right, technocratic way
yeah,
of ruling. Right. It's
right,
not just power that you're going to impose your
right,
will. It's you're going to now, of course, you know, even on a scientific level, it doesn't make sense anymore, right? I mean, because they can't even
right,
follow the
right,
science, but there's still that
right,
pretense
right.
that it's scientific.
Yeah. And I kind of think it's it's a little bit of a test of democracy as it is, right? Like supposedly you have a marketplace of ideas, and the best ideas went out, and that's why we'll wrap up because we've taken up enough of Eli's time now. But Eli has been just a force in terms of where he went from like April, March 2020, and now and to where he is now. He's really one of the folks that speaks out, with very rational stuff about, and he doesn't just uncritically accept this expert or that expert, this media personality or this media person saying whatever. So Eli, I mean, we're seeing how democracy meets up to the test here, and you're in some ways a super important part of that, because you are now one of the major, whether you want to or not, you're one of the major folks out there that's kind of putting ideas out there to say, hey, wait a second, why are you diminishing natural immunity? Hey, wait a second, don't you think vax mandates are going to be are going to have are going to be racist and affect minorities more in places that are underserved if you have a vax mandate for businesses in terms of them coming in. So hopefully more and more people hear at least your side of it, and you've kind of willed your way there. You're not somebody that comes from a credentialed public health expert background. You've kind of you've grown in following and in terms of your weight, based on the fact that what you say makes a tremendous amount of sense. So kudos, Eli, in terms of doing that.
Well, thank you so much. I have the same level of, if not more, respect for you. And we need rational doctors too. So thank you for, and I appreciate your feedback on my Twitter feed. It's not easy battling these kind of extremist experts, but
Yeah.
they do make it easy. I got to be honest. I mean, it's just bizarre at some point how and sometimes they'll say, well, you're just an art dealer, and I'll say, well, that's exactly why I shouldn't so easily be able to correct you. So
It has been.
Hopefully we'll
It has
get
been. It has
better.
been. Yeah. It is. Absolutely, it's been an absolute joy to watch. So they attempt to come after
Eli,
with
we'll put
the
your
usual credential stuff and not attack argument, and yeah.
Eli, we'll put your Twitter handle on the show notes, but can you give it to the audience here who's?
I mean, it's just the Eli Klein. So TheEliKlein.
The Eli Klein. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.